All right, so let's break down and get into our 4Ws here. And so we'll talk about each of these independently and go over why these are important. So let's start with water. So why do I care about the water? And in that 8-hour training that we do, we spend a long time on water, and we actually will separate it into production water, so water that you're using when you're producing the fruits and vegetables, and then we also separate it out into post-harvest water. So it's water, just like it sounds, everything after harvest. So this could even be the water that you're drinking or you're using to wash surfaces or tools or whatnot. So water, if it's contaminated, it can cause a whole heap of problems, right? And we use water for so much stuff on the farm, right? And any of these pathogens could be found in water. So talking about E. coli, salmonella, so the bacteria, obviously, so parasites, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora, and that's how we can move them around on the farm. So if you think about, say, irrigation water, right? If that's contaminated and we are using that to irrigate all of our crop, well, now all of our crop could be potentially contaminated, right? So that's why water is so important. And we use it for a bazillion things, right? So when we're talking about ag water, it's for irrigation, pesticide application, frost protection, post-harvest washing, whatever, right? So this is used for so much. And then when you have a situation like this, where we have a dump tank, right? And we reuse this water. Now, if some of this was contaminated and the rest wasn't, well, once I put it all in there, now everything could be contaminated, right? So it's just it's a very high possibility that we could introduce contamination this way. So when we talk about water sources, typically we have 3 water sources that's going to be used. So first, we have municipal systems or city water. Then we have groundwater, so it would be like a well, and also surface water. So that could be like ponds, ditches, streams, rivers, things like that. So all of these can be used for irrigation purposes, for agricultural water, but each of them carry a different risk. And so we'll talk about that in these next few slides. So municipal water sources are the least likely to be contaminated because legally they're selling you potable water. And so that wastewater treatment plant or that city where they're doing the water, they have to test it. It has to be potable, which means 0 detectable E. coli that's present. So you're buying that from them. So legally they have to do that. So this is the least likely to be contaminated. And so again, because you're buying this, typically you can go to their, whatever your city's website is, and they will have copies of those tests that you can just download and take a look at them. And then we also have wells. And so wells, again, are lower risk because they're sealed, right? We're not going to have, water should not, in theory, if everything's working right, water should not be getting inside that well. And so here are just some tips for protecting those wells. So they should be inspected annually just to make sure the casing isn't cracked, that you don't have an area where water can get into the well. Using any backflow prevention fittings is a good idea, and that's just showing that here with that arrow. Again, keeping livestock away from active recharge areas. And again, we just are trying to minimize the likelihood that any of these pathogens could get into the well. And again, that's why inspecting that well at least annually before you're going to use it for irrigation is important. So this water too, I would test this water at least yearly. You would not, depending how big you are at your operation. If you're small, there'd be no requirement for you to do it. Again, unless the buyer asks you to. But I do think it's a good idea to do at least once annually, and it should cost you in testing for generic E. coli, and it should cost around between, say, $30 to maybe $50 or less, in that range. So I think it's a good idea to do. And then we have surface water. So a lot of people do use surface water for irrigation purposes, and you totally can. There's nothing saying you can't, but it is the most likely to be contaminated. And just because we have no control over what's walking through it, what's swimming in it, what's flying over it, right? So we're just at the mercy of whatever that water quality happens to be that day. And it's probably going to change daily. So especially unless, I mean, ponds that are on properties are a little bit, you can control that a little bit more, but especially if it's like a ditch or a river, there's very little control that you would have over that. So again, surface water would be the most likely to be contaminated. So if you do use surface water, we want to kind of prevent what's happening in this picture, right? We don't want cattle swimming around or walking around in that water and pooping in there. And then that's what we're going to use for irrigation, right? So we want to keep any livestock out of there. If you're using raw manure, we want to make sure you apply it away, at least, or store it, or however you're doing, but try to stay away from whatever that water source is, because raw manure can certainly contaminate that water. And look for any runoff too. So if you have a good rain and everything runs down to where that pond is, and you have raw manure that's sitting there, that could cause contamination too. So when we think about irrigation, again, I think you want to think about it in terms of what kind of water am I using, right? So if you are using surface water and you can do it, probably drip irrigation is the best, right? Because that's probably this water then won't even touch the edible portion of the crop, because most of the time people will put it under plastic. And so again, you're also conserving water because you're applying it directly to the roots where it's used, but also it probably won't touch the harvestable portion. So if it is surface water, you're reducing that risk that contamination could happen. But then if you use overhead irrigation, like the bottom picture, right, it's wet water's touching everything. So probably if you're having to use surface water, overhead irrigation isn't the best, because it's going to touch everything, get everything wet. And especially if it's the harvestable portion of the crop, that's the most like highest then that you could cause contamination. So again, depending on what water you're using, there's different risk levels. And then whatever you have to use, we can think about different irrigation strategies to be able to use that water safely. But again, nobody's going to say you can't use that water. You certainly can. We just have to know there could be a risk involved. So water testing, like I said, I am an advocate at least once a year if you have a well. Again, and if depending how big you are, there are some water tests that will be required. But it's just a good thing to do, just so you know what that water quality is. And I always tell people, test it when it's close to the time you're actually going to be using it. Testing a well that you're going to use for irrigation in January isn't really necessarily, well, hopefully it is what it is in June or July, but it'd be better just to test it in June or July when you're going to use it, right? So if you can test as close to when you're going to need that water source, the better. So, just having an idea, and especially if you're using surface water, that's going to fluctuate. Though that bacterial level will fluctuate throughout the entire year. And I'll guarantee when it's warm out, so these are human pathogenic bacteria. So guess what temperature they like to grow at? Our temperature, right? 98.6. So you can imagine when we're harvesting things in June, July, August in Indiana, we get a lot of 98.6 days, and they can grow either side of that, but that's their optimum. But they can grow it lower, they can grow it slightly higher, right? So if they have water, they have a food source, which they would get it from growing on that fruit or vegetable, and they have the right temperature, they're going to grow to high numbers very quickly, these bacteria. So knowing what that water quality is as close as to when you're going to use it is the best practice. So this is recommended, this testing schedule, but again, probably most people aren't required to do any testing. But we recommend, so if you're using surface water, so yearly before use, when you're really going to use it, then doing it monthly, even if when you're using it, so is it June, July, August, whatever, or of course as required by regulation. But if you're small enough, there usually isn't any requirement to test your water. And only we're saying monthly because surface water is risky, right? Like I said, you're going to have that fluctuation of bacterial growth and what those numbers are. So that's why we say monthly. But well water, it shouldn't change throughout the year, right? Unless you have surface water getting into your well somehow. So yearly, so once a year, pull a test and test for generic E. coli. And then municipal water, you don't need to test because they do that for you. So if you go to our website, so it's this www.safeproducein, just like up here in this logo.com. We have resources. So if you're in Indiana, at least, we have water testing labs that will do the right test for you, identified. So you can pick from that lab, and you would typically pick the closest one to you. But you can check that out. So we have a bunch of resources on our website. So where do you collect samples? So surface and groundwater, we want to make sure we're getting a representative sample, right? So we want to try to get in the middle, but we don't want to get down into sediment if we're testing a pond, because that's not where we're irrigating out of, right? So just make sure you're taking a representative sample. And then again, the municipal water, there's nothing you need to do. They have those water tests for you. And so when you contact a lab, so step number one is you're going to contact a lab and say you want to test your well water, whatever water it is, for generic E. coli. They are going to have a list of things. They'll likely send you a collection bottle, because every lab likes to do it their own specific way. So they'll give you very detailed and specific instructions on how to collect those water samples. You need a sterile bottle. And so, like I said, typically the lab will send that to you, and then you collect the sample and you send it back. And also, usually in that sample collection bottle is a little tablet, and it's called sodium thiosulfate, and all that does is neutralize chlorine. So if you do, say you're sampling your tap water, for example, it might have chlorine in it if it's city water, and so it just neutralizes anything that could be in there. But again, if you're using a distribution system, you want to make sure you let that run well before you collect your sample. Because what we want to know is what the quality of the water is in our well or in the surface water, and not necessarily what could be growing right inside that rim. So that's why you want to let the water flow for a while and then collect your sample. Yep, so this is exactly collecting the water sample. You sanitize that spigot rim. So whether it's from a hose or whatever wherever you're contacting that water, that main water source. So that could be, you take a little bit of bleach and wipe that off. That's that rim. We can use a lighter, heat it up, right? That'll kill anything that's there. You want to run the water for at least a couple minutes. So we want to, be like, this is what I'm talking about, sanitizing this, like on this hose, let that water run a couple minutes, fill up that sample jar, close it. And then if you're bringing it to the lab, we want to keep it on ice or keep it as cold as possible, even if you're shipping it to the lab, because keeping it cold will make sure that if there are any bacteria in there, they're not going to start growing. So if you leave it at room temperature and bacteria are in there, they could start growing and wouldn't be a representative sample. What actually is in your water, it's going to look a lot worse than what it really is. So you do want to try to keep that in mind, and maybe you have to put it on ice when you take it to the lab, or put it on cold packs to ship it, something like that. And some of these companies will come out and do this for you. And I know, especially if you live anywhere where there's plain communities, so Amish, a lot of those labs, they have this service. So, I mean, you pay for it, obviously, but one less thing you have to worry about. So like I said, you got to find a certified lab. The Indiana Department of Health, they do water testing in Indy. You can contact them, but there's all kinds of places that will do water testing. But again, you're going to test for generic E. coli and just make sure that that's what they can do. And then make sure that that lab is giving you the information that you need to collect that sample. So here in this picture, you can see this looks very similar to what the Department of Health has. They have your water collection bottles, right? And they give you a box. They give you all these instructions how to collect the sample. And they give us a box that you ship it back to them, right? So, and typically overnight, or you can drop it off, whatever, depending how close the lab is to you. So how are my samples tested? So pretty much what happens, it's a filtration. And so they're going to filter that water, collect the bacteria that are present on the water. They incubate that, the bacteria start growing, and then they're going to express it if they call colony forming units. I think I have this in here. Well, I don't. I will talk. So they express it in colony forming units. And all that means is that that number goes back to how many bacteria were in that original sample. Because, right, we can't see bacteria with our naked eye. So we have to be able to grow these colonies up of bacteria to see what was in that original sample. And so this is an example of one of the sampling devices, but that's typically what they do. And again, we're going to look for generic E. coli, because it is an established indicator that there was fecal contamination present. So of what this is showing here, we have a group of bacteria called total coliforms. In that group is what we call fecal coliforms. So just like it sounds, are from feces. And then in that, we have this generic E. coli. And then a subset of that then could be the pathogenic E. coli. So when I test for generic E. coli, that doesn't mean that water is going to make somebody sick. That just means it's an indicator that something's not good in there, right? So not necessarily any pathogens, but it just means, like, you know, something's wrong. So again, we don't usually test for some of these other things, just because we know this E. coli, it's pretty cheap to test for, and it's a good indicator that contamination is present. So like I said, these are generally expressed as colony forming units per 100 mils. And so you'll get a number back if you're doing the enumeration. If this is the water that well, I think I probably have it in here, but I'll say it right now. If this is the water that you're using for post-harvest, so this is the water that you're using for drinking, for hand washing, whatever, we don't want any generic E. coli in there. We want 0. So in that case, in that scenario, you only have to test for presence or absence. I don't need a number, right? Because if it's present, it's bad. And those tests are even cheaper, the presence or absence tests. So you don't need to have an actual number. So some people only do that. They're like, well, I don't care, you know, what the number is. If I get E. coli in my well, I'm going to shock it. I'm going to retest. So presence, absence is fine. So it just depends on what information you want. But if we have irrigation water that is above 126 CFU per 100 mils of water, it is considered too contaminated to use for production. So you're allowed to have some, but if it's over this limit, you probably should be looking for another source or figuring something else out. And this number actually came from the Environmental Protection Agency, and this is the limit for beach water. So what this is saying is if your water is clean enough to swim in, it's clean enough to irrigate with. That's exactly what this is saying. So what if it's 127? Is that worse? Probably not, but this is the EPA's limit to allow somebody to swim in water. So that's where that number came from. So bad water test does not put you out of business. And again, especially if you're using that water, if it's not, say, not the day before harvest, the longer the time that you apply the water and you harvest, the better, if it does have E. coli in it. So all this means, if you get a bad test, you need to figure something out, right? So maybe you need to shock the well, maybe you need to find a different water source, maybe you need to treat the water with some sort of sanitizer before you use it, whatever, right? So it just means something needs to be done. And so after that, you get that result, we reevaluate, right? And decide what we can do. And so there are things, so this is, I shouldn't have put this. So this is the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule. Just disregard this. We could get into that. I could do a whole hour just talking about that in itself. But that is for usually bigger growers would have to comply. But we do have types of corrective measures that we can use if that water does, if it's over that 126 CFU per 100 mils. So like I said, apply a time interval for microbial die-off. So the longer you leave in between when you use the water and you harvest, the better, because bacteria is going to start dying in that time interval, because they can dry out, the UV from the sun can kill them, right? They're going to start declining. So the longer we can push that window, the better. You can re-inspect the water system, make any changes, or like I said, treat the water. So something has to be done. It's very dependent on what your operation looks like and what your current practices are. And here's some of the things to ask yourself, is it an ongoing or repeated problem? So maybe you sample your well, you get positive E. coli, you shock it, which means you add sanitizer to it, you test it again, and it's fine. All right, move on. Right, so you might have to do something like that. Or, if it's surface water, maybe you have to add some sort of sanitizer in there to use it. Or maybe you have to find a different water source. It just depends. Yep. And again, so this is sort of the same, but always make sure if you're using any of these sanitizers that you do follow the label. All right, so now let's talk about post-harvest. So that was mostly on the production side. Let's talk about post-harvest. So here's an example of a cantaloupe line. I think this is down in southern Indiana. But again, post-harvest water, we're using it for a ton of different stuff too, right? So we're using it for washing, we're using it for hydropooling, ice, flumes, dump tanks, you name it, right? So again, if this water is contaminated, it's even worse, because this is typically the last thing that's going to touch that produce before it's out your door. So if this is contaminated, we're in big trouble, right? There's other things that we talked about, applying that interval, increasing that interval on the production water, maybe we can have bacteria die. But this is even more important, that we don't have harmful bacteria associated with this water. So again, this is going to be zero detectable E. coli. So we're going to do the presence absence test for this, but so it has to be potable. And again, this is the same water we're going to be used for drinking, right? So it makes sense. We don't want to drink E. coli The other thing that sometimes, or often, especially smaller farms, that well is the same well that's at your house, right? So, and maybe that's water you're using for irrigation too. And so if that's the case, that well, then if it's used for both, it needs to have zero detectable E. coli in it. So this is I'm going to just talk about this briefly. And this is talking about water temperature. And so if we have if there's a big temperature difference between the water that we're using and the temperature of the produce, it basically can cause this to happen. And this is, okay, let me explain this here. So what happens if you have so say, I'm going to give you, super hot tomato and ice cold water, and you're going to wash that tomato. Well, what happens is that bacteria, so especially like on that stem scar, you can see right here, or if there's any bruising or damage on the tomato, because of this huge temperature difference, you can create a vacuum. And any of those bacteria that would be on the surface, they can get sucked into the inside, which produces what you call this infiltration. And so this is an example. So you can imagine, and we did this, but the temperature has to be a very, very huge difference. So basically we were microwaving tomatoes. Well, first we took the tomatoes and threw them on the ground to show a crack, to get a crack. Then we microwaved them and put then this blue dye on the stem scar and then threw it into icy cold water. And so then cutting this tomato in half, so you can see, right, how this blue dye infiltrated into the inside of the tomato. So just imagine this is just to mimic what if bacteria were present there, right? You would have the same effect. So what's the solution? Either heat up your water a little bit or cool this product down a tad. So just decrease that temperature difference. So however you want to manage it, but just keep that in mind. If it's a huge, icy, super hot produce and you picked it right from the field on a hot July day into icy cold water, that's where you could have that problem. So just keep that in mind. So with
Doctor, sorry, that is news to me, and it's kind of hard to follow the logic of why that happens. Is it because the tomato is shrinking because of the cold?
Well, it basically creates a vacuum, and it doesn't matter. So where they always show this originally was they had a cantaloupe, and that's a picture that we usually show. And then they sliced the cantaloupe, and you could see that dye. And it sort of makes sense, right? Because there's that cavity that a vacuum could be created with this.
True.
Right? But we were able to show this with tomatoes too. I mean, we did this because I was always skeptical of this happening. But it does. But again, it's this huge temperature. Like literally we were microwaving tomatoes and putting it in icy cold water.
When you were doing that, could you handle the tomato still? Was it so hot you couldn't handle it?
Well, we didn't handle it very long. Let's just put it that way.
So is the
really got it and stuck it in the cold water.
Is the opposite true? I mean, could you outgas bacteria if you took a cold tomato and put it in hot water?
I would think you could. I've never done that. Like I haven't done that experiment myself, but I would guess you could.
Oh, pretty interesting. Thanks.
Yep, you bet. Good question. All right. So post-harvest water, we could add a sanitizer. And so again, over here are some common post-harvest sanitizers. So chlorine, peroxyacetic acid. So first off, like I said in the beginning, there's nothing saying you have to wash your produce. And then if you do decide to wash your produce, there's nothing saying you have to put a sanitizer in it. Your buyer may make you, and if, like I said before, if your buyer is telling you you have to do that, well, if that's where you want to sell, you have to do it. But there's nothing, and there's no regulation that says you have to wash. And if you do wash, there's nothing saying you have to use a sanitizer.
Doctor,
Mhm.
sorry, on those sanitizers, the ones they sell for home use are just vinegar. But you don't suggest that here?
Well, so proxyacetic acid is actually this basically it's smells like vinegar. It has acetic.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So what do sanitizers do? They can kill the bacteria in the water. They can kill bacteria that could be on the surface of the fruits and vegetables, and they definitely do help prevent cross-contamination. So if, especially, remember that picture I showed you with the lettuce, all the lettuce in there in this big dump tank or dunk tank, whatever you want to call it. If you put sanitizers in there, it's just basically like what this picture is showing you, right? The sanitizer can kill some of these bacteria that are coming off that produce. So in those kind of situations, when that water is getting reused, I do think it's a good idea to put a sanitizer in there. But again, your call. Nobody's gonna there's nothing saying you have to do that. So what sanitizers don't do? Okay, they're never gonna make dirty water clean, right? A sanitizer is never gonna turn this bucket of water here into that. They don't kill all bacteria equally effectively. They don't effectively manage biofilms. They help. So biofilms are just these bunch of bacteria that they form a substance. And once they form this substance, it's super hard and they become a biofilm. It's really hard to remove them from the surface. So they help by adding a sanitizer and using that on a regular basis in combination with cleaning. They really do help reduce biofilms, but they're not going to effectively manage a biofilm on its own. And they don't sterilize a product or surface. So that means they're not going to kill everything that's there, but they're going to kill a chunk, a majority. So typically most of these sanitizers that we work with kill about 99% of bacteria, which is still good. But if you go back to thinking about 70 or 17 billion cells that we talked about before, still having 1% of 17 billion is still quite a bit, right? So we just want to keep that in mind. So sanitizers are affected by the temperature of the water, turbidity. Temperature not always. Some of them are, most of them really not. Turbidity, that just means how dirty it is. So, right, if I'm going to use, say, I want to put chlorine in my water, but I'm working with water that looks like this, forget it. So that chlorine, all the killing capacity of that chlorine product will get used up by the organic matter in this water. So, and it's not necessarily you need this water either. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean. There can be organic matter in it. But when it's this dirty, adding more chlorine to this is not going to help anything. You're just wasting money. So it's better to get rid of that dirty water, get some clean water, and go from there. And the label is the law. So any sanitizer that you use, it needs to say that it is for fruit and vegetable washing, or it is for a food contact surface, or whatever you're trying to do with it. Right? So it has to have that use on there. It'll tell you how to use it, precautions, how to dispose of it. It'll give you all that information on the label. And this is just an example of one sanitizer. So we can do this game. So do I need a sanitizer? So I'm washing radishes in a sink with running water from a faucet and the water's potable. Do I need a sanitizer? Probably not, right? Because we're not reusing, it's just running water, not reusing it. And the water's potable to begin with. So second one, wash line sprays water and peppers as they go by on a conveyor. The water is not reused and the water is potable. So again, probably not. I don't need a sanitizer. In any of these, could you use one? Yeah, sure. But the risk isn't really there. So now let's go to number 3. So lettuce is dunked in tubs of cold water. The first tub removes most of the dirt. The second tub removes the rest. And the water is potable at start and reused for several batches. This is the time I would probably use one, right? Because this would be the highest risk right? Because we're using that water, the bacteria that's coming off on the surface can be in there, and we'd like to clean that up if possible.